Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Health Tech Entrepreneurs Meetup. We are recording right now, so check us out on the MDC Studios YouTube channel. You'll also be able to find past meetup recordings there. Today's speaker is Katie Kirsch, a serial entrepreneur experienced in launching medtech and biotech products in both the domestic and international markets. So I'll let her introduce herself in more detail later. And today's topic is launching medical and biotech products both here and abroad. So let's start with our usual introductions. So I will start and then I'll go down the list to my right. And so when I call your name, please unmute yourself. Let us know who you are, what you're working on. If there are any issues you're facing that you'd like help for, if you're able to provide any help, this is a great time to let us know. So hi, everyone. I'm Neo Gamo. I am the Vice President of Business Development at the MDC Studio, a startup studio dedicated to building health and medtech device products from the early stages. I'm also the founder and CEO of Neurosonics Medical, where we're developing a minimally invasive therapeutic ultrasound device designed for neurosurgical applications. I'm also an associate at the Verte Opportunity Fund family of funds, where we focus on investing in high growth companies in locating opportunity zones across the country. Great. So now I'll ask everyone else to introduce themselves. Alex. All right.
Oh, sorry, I was trying to unmute. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I just graduated from the BME PhD program at Hopkins, and I'm looking to spin out my research into a company called Prompt Diagnostics, trying to make affordable and accessible diagnostics for everyone.
Awesome. Welcome and congratulations.
Thanks so much.
Cyrus?
Yes, Cyrus Mogadam. I'm a president of RPM Tech. We're a product development company, a group of about 22 now. Electrical, mechanical, software, firmware engineers, industrial designers, system engineers, and we also have model makers. So we do concepts, prototypes, transition to production. We innovate and solve problems. Nice to meet everyone.
Wonderful. Gil?
So I'm Gil Blankenship, a school teacher at the University of Maryland and part-time entrepreneur, I suppose. So anyway, it's great to see you, Katie.
Yes, Gil helps to, well, he is the founder and chairman of the MDC Studio. And so he is a parallel entrepreneur. I'll skip over Katie because I'll let you introduce yourself later. Wayne?
Hi, Wayne Sternberger. I'm co-founder and CTO of Blocks and Up. We are developing a novel patient monitor that allows objective and quantitative real-time information about neural blockades or regional anesthetics, and have a lot of needs. Technology is going gangbusters, but business development is where we're hurting right now.
Awesome, thank you. And Joseph?
Hi, I'm a recent Johns Hopkins BME grad student, or I graduated, and I'm now working at an early stage medical device startup called Optosurgical, where we're developing an imaging tool for endocrine and head and neck surgeons to better identify parathyroid glands intraoperatively. I'm here just to learn and hear the talk. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so I will hand it off to Katie, but I'll introduce her first. So Katie is a serial entrepreneur experienced in launching medical and biotech products, both here and in international markets, including emerging markets in Africa and Southeast Asia. She helped to launch Hemafuse for Sisu Global Health in Ghana and Kenya. She's currently an innovation specialist with UNICEF's Product Innovation Center based in Copenhagen, Denmark, where she's working on an oxygen system planning tool. She's also a consultant advisor.
Did we lose Neo or is it just me?
No, I think Neo froze. She'll be back.
McGill University in Canada. So Katie,
Thanks. No, we lost you for just a minute, but that's fine. You got most of it, so that was great.
Wonderful.
So thank you, everybody. Yeah, as Neo mentioned, I am an entrepreneur and startup founder at heart. I love to travel, and that involves basically incorporating that into starting companies in different places. So recently, as was mentioned, I've started working with UNICEF as a consultant for their oxygen system planning tool. Though UNICEF treats consultants kind of like full-time employees without some of the benefits. So you take it all with a grain of salt to kind of move projects forward. Most of what I'm doing is remote, so I'm still based in Baltimore, but I'm supporting the training and basically business development scale for this Excel-based planning tool that measures both oxygen demand in the country and also their CapEx, OpEx planning, so they can make sure they have the proper equipment that's required for oxygen. So a tool that came before COVID, got picked up because of COVID, and is now something that is going to be integrated into UNICEF's kind of long-term strategy. So it's been an interesting curve. So.
Wonderful. So can you tell us, how you came to, be in this line of work, and some of the past roles you've had in international business?
Sure. So I started working internationally, just as I said before, because I like to travel. So in undergrad, I went to Albion College in Michigan, a very small school, close to Michigan University, University of Michigan. I see your jacket, Wayne. And I started there just by, trying out new things, ended up being a French major. And walked into my college professor's room and said basically, hey, I want to study abroad, and I don't want to go to France because it seems like the same thing. So I ended up studying abroad in Cameroon, and that kind of started this sort of journey of evolving into international support, and then also understanding that education in the international scene was not a place I belonged. So I did an internship with the State Department in Paramaribo, Suriname in undergraduate school, and then that led to a Fulbright scholarship in Rwanda, where I actually was exposed to an amazing group called Partners in Health, which was started by the esteemed Paul Farmer, Dr. Paul Farmer, who recently passed away, unfortunately. And from there, kind of got an understanding that working in health and medical was much more my speed and my place. And then it being, 2013, 2012, to date myself a bit. And it was the end of one of the recessions. And as somebody who had just recently graduated and didn't have any experience, it was still very difficult to get a job. Feels very different than now. And from there, I ended up meeting some engineers from University of Michigan, and basically working on a product development nonprofit called Centricycle that we ended up evolving into what is now Sisu Global Health, and developing products directly with hospitals in different African countries to then commercialize broadly. And then from there, I stepped down as my chief marketing officer role in 2018, and ended up working with a group locally called Irazu Bio to help start their business planning around their unique model of integrating tech transfer, academia, and pharma business development. Did that for about a year, and then had the same career crisis that most people had in 2020, and decided to start consulting for a while. And so I've been consulting ever since, with a series of several different startup studios in different places, as well as now UNICEF and other startups in Africa have started talks with me. So that's been the evolution. So I have stayed in one job for quite a while, and now I'm just enjoying this period and looking at different ideas.
Wonderful. That's quite a journey. So I'd like to know, how do you recommend, or how do you think about developing a product and marketing it if you're already thinking about, marketing in different, countries, cultures, customs? What can we, what do you recommend we start thinking about early on?
So early on in that kind of product development phase, I think it's really important to tie some of the just ideas, because nothing's going to stay the same, but ideas around marketing and what that user experience is going to look like.
Yeah.
We know that different places have different criteria, but at the end of the day, especially in healthcare, you do have similarities that do exist. And so finding those kind of key similarities that can translate across multiple markets is really valuable, but also then understanding that end user experience is really important, because you need to scale at some point. So finding something that's very niche to just one custom is not going to be helpful in the long run.
Yeah.
But at the same time, having to really integrate a lot of different user experience is really important.
So how do you evaluate market opportunities in different places, including developing countries?
I mean, the best way, frankly, and this is why I say I'm not a digital marketing person, is really local and person-to-person engagement in some form. And I think especially in low to middle income countries, like relationships are immensely important for adoption later on. But I also see that in the US and different markets in the US broadly. So kind of evaluating those opportunities really does require a little bit of in-person engagement at minimum. You can do testing, some surveying or some interviewing or that sort of thing to initially get started, but it's really not, sometimes things that you're told on the phone like that may be more to appreciate your ego than to actually give you valid advice or experience on what the user will actually use that tool or product in the long run. The other thing is that, in that phase before having that investment in that like direct engagement, if you're looking at low to middle income countries in health, the WHO often routinely publishes their guidelines and their recommendations for what they expect countries and healthcare systems to provide to their citizens, essentially. And I think those are great tools because UNICEF and all the other NGOs end up falling in line with those because it's the major peer review group that kind of controls those guidelines. However, they're not the only way because WHO takes years to publish their guidelines. For example, we've been trying to work with them to establish guidelines on oxygen equipment, and it's not going to be ready for another at least year. And we're already, 3 years into a pandemic at this point, looking at that. So, and then the third place that's a really good place to look is clinical societies. So in every African country I was in, there were always these clinical societies that African doctors would be a part of. And those are really good places. And sometimes they're, in Europe or they're in the US, and you can actually engage with potential partners there and get a large group of them in one place.
Awesome. So you mentioned earlier, trying to find similarities across, different countries, different cultures. How about some differences that you really need to keep in mind? And, one thing I'm thinking of is regulatory pathways in different places.
So I think one of the hard learnings we learned at Sisu was that getting your US FDA, or if you're in a European market, getting CE mark is going to make that regulatory pathway issue much easier, but it's also very difficult to get those US FDA and CE mark at the same time, especially because each of them also requires that you have a US or European market. So if you're trying to market things directly for, Russia or Kenya, but you don't have a US market, they're not going to sign off on your product.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's also where that kind of marketing piece also comes into play. So for example, Sisu, we started out by getting regulatory in individual countries in Ghana and Kenya, and I was leading a lot of the regulatory submission coordination. My CTO did a lot of the submission pieces, as well as one of our analysts. And that was effective to kind of get into the markets and to start, but we still had a lot of pushback because we didn't have US FDA. And so now, for example, we have US FDA with a military exemption, basically. So it's a military use of Hemafuse, not a typical hospital use. Mm-hmm. And that allowed us to, I mean, I think they're in 6 countries now, looking to expand into India. So that really kind of catapulted that sort of product push significantly.
I see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about differences, or maybe there are similarities? How about like distribution channels, distribution sales channels in different places?
It's really difficult.
Yeah.
I have a couple examples of doing like initial market pilots in Ghana and in Kenya. In Ghana, some of the biggest issues is, I mean, I think this is any country, US included, is understanding that your distributor partner, if that's the model you're going and you're not doing sales directly, has good quality control and has great representation for the markets you need. That was very difficult to find in Ghana and Kenya because the markets there consist primarily of, like, they had branches, so they had a Johnson & Johnson, and the Johnson & Johnson team had their own distribution and that sort of piece. And then there was like 40 distributors that we found, but after I evaluated them, it was like, I don't trust this warehouse that we're going to put this product in, for example. So I think it's a very difficult, time-consuming process. Yeah. That being said, there are a couple smaller companies that have come out that specifically are addressing this problem, including Via Global Health. And then a colleague of mine is also starting one. I'm sorry, I'm just looking up the name again because it's brand new. I think it's Gear Health or Akonova, and he's targeting a lot of the nonprofits and the nonprofit focus. The distributor and sales chain is a lacking piece because it's been so under invested in from and for NGOs or any of those things, and Doctors Without Borders, et cetera. They build their own supply chain or their own ways to bring product in country and then leave often. So there's not really this sustainable, like, entrepreneurial ecosystem often. There does end up being partners, but it takes a while to get there.
Yeah. No, that's an important point to keep in mind. Great. So I think a lot of us, we're here, we start to, develop, a product. We know the US market, what the needs are. We, learn about the hospital, purchasing system here. So what if we, first develop it for here and maybe Europe, and then we suddenly think, oh, we wanted to, maybe we should, try to target this, foreign market. So how would you go about, doing that, thinking about features we should keep, things we should change?
Yeah, so I think first of all is you have to look at, and the reason we started developing medical devices for markets specifically was we were seeing a big gap in that sort of development. There was a lot of devices that were developed and then maybe, had some small changes and then were sent over and then didn't work long-term for whatever reason. And I think so it's important to look at environmental factors, such as electrical voltage. Consistent personnel is always a big issue. There's a lot of turnover. You just have much less staff to work with. I mean, much fewer clinicians, et cetera. And I think the other thing is the investment worth it? So, if you're going to make some pretty drastic product changes, are those really worth the market you're going into? And, I would think that decision has to be made kind of in tandem with either a strong marketing partner or something in country or distribution partner, be that an NGO or a distributor, a regular distributor.
Yeah, and I remember From some time I spent with Sisu, I learned about this medical device graveyard.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a bit more about that and why that's happening?
Yeah, and that's, I think, another good point. So the medical device graveyard is something that is talked about often in NGOs and never done anything about, and it's very frustrating. Essentially, it's this idea that equipment is either donated often or sold, and it just doesn't have the right specifications for meeting a need. And sometimes that's something as simple as it's the instructions or the keypads are in German, to like the humidity is too high in some of these contexts, or there's not great airflow. We see that a lot with some of the PSA oxygen plants that we're delivering. They have to have a good amount of airflow in some of the places that they're putting in. And that there's often just kind of, there's just traditionally been this mentality of bringing equipment in, deposit it, train someone, and then leave, without this idea of what is maintenance, what are these like ongoing pieces. And that's a big topic we talk about at UNICEF right now, and are trying to, another American colleague and I are trying to make sure is a part of that development chain, especially for something like oxygen, which is a huge like ecosystem. It's not just a vaccine you're giving someone, right? It's something you have to maintain over time.
So yeah, it's I think what I learned from that is it's not enough to just make it cheaper. There's a lot more to adoption in different places.
Because if you have to replace it, then it's not cheaper in the long run, which is a very hard thing to sometimes market as well.
Yeah. So do you recommend, and like, how early should we start thinking about, marketing in a product in different places?
I mean, I think it depends how big the market size is, right? It has to be, or your mission goal, right? So market size can be interchangeable with mission goal. So when we started Sisu, the mission was to specifically develop devices that were going to help in this area. And we were able to make the market size with more research and understanding of where costs actually are, because there is money that exists in these markets and is being spent. But understanding where those are is I think, really important in understanding which markets you want to enter. And I think there's another value too, is that in doing clinical testing, and I've seen more countries do that, or more companies in the US do this, is doing very ethical clinical testing in other countries that have lower regulatory situations, but have similar needs, and maybe just need whatever you're working on sooner than we necessarily do in the US, in a very just crowded. The US is just very crowded in as far as all the new medical devices that are being put out, and at the same time, a very, very fractured market. Whereas some of these countries have universal healthcare. And so if you can do a clinical study, build those clinical relationships, and then get insurance coverage, you've gotten the whole market. So there can be a lot of different shortcuts that happen in these markets that you could then take to show to FDA, to advertise in the US, whatever that sort of piece is, that it's being used in these other places.
Okay, interesting. And so yours, the next question, I think you're in a unique position to address. How are things different between when you're launching products through a for-profit versus an NGO?
Yeah, they're very different. And I think it boils down to this way of thinking that is also present in academia, of grant project-based thinking versus sustainable organizational thinking and investment related thinking. So when you go to ask for money for a grantor, and that's what all these NGOs and what UNICEF does with the UN to validate public money, it's what are we going to achieve in this year? And then we'll release money, and then maybe there'll be grant funding next year, but we don't really know. So, get what you can done in this year period, and then maybe the donors will think about some other global health area next year. So you have a lot of how much can we get done in this small period of time, and then let's switch to a completely different health area and hope that works. So keeping that in mind, there's a lot more I think, or maybe just like a different type of politics that's involved with NGOs. And they often operate on longer timelines and maybe make decisions not purely based on impact or clinical studies. There's often some other conversations happening behind, and so it can be very difficult to get with those. However, if you are able to have a purchasing partner in country, so we worked with AMREF, which is, I forget the acronym, forgive me, but it's, I think, the African Medical Rescue Emergency Foundation, something like that, forgive me. And they were similar to Doctors Without Borders in that they launched these surgical camps, and they wanted Hemafuse because it was a non-electric way to do blood transfusion in a emergency situation. So they were a great purchasing partner because they could work with our distributor or even import products through their own channels and operate on that way. They just operate on a very different space. And so if you're looking at that versus like a contract with a hospital, there are clear steps and somewhat clearer steps in my mind of just understanding what is the costing from, if I sell this to a distributor, they get this much markup. If I sell it to the hospital, that's how much the retail cost is. It's a little different with NGOs in how they think and how the kind of long-term investment is not always there.
Interesting. So I now have a couple of questions that people sent me when they registered. So what are some lessons you learned, and is there anything you'd go back and do differently?
That's like the always the best and worst question. I mean, we started Sisu in our like early 20s. So like there's probably so many just like adult things we needed to learn alongside just basic business planning pieces. But I think the biggest one that is really coming to term right now is learning how to rest and like how to appropriately take care of your health is very important when working in healthcare. I was traveling basically every 6 weeks on 24-hour flights. I gave myself adult asthma. Like I definitely had like a myriad of burnout symptoms when I ended up leaving Sisu, and it was the right decision for me at the time. And now I still work with them as a part owner on different things. And so I think that's like one of the biggest things is like whenever you're starting a company, and especially adding this extra difficulty of being based in the US, but trying to market in different countries, is really learning how to rest. And I think that's very different. It's very different than any of my peers, even who worked in healthcare in the US. So I think that was like the first thing that I really wish I'd learned sooner. But from a specifically like a business sort of piece and a business management is really getting patient capital that was understanding that you were working in these completely new areas that were new to a new innovation and didn't have a lot of the same systems that the US did. We got very, excuse me, I have a visitor. We got very, we had very medical device focused entrepreneurs who were US focused. So it was always about how are you going to bring this back to the US market in some way? And we always had the military piece that was going to be a part of what we do and maybe a spin out company. But our mission was to work in these different countries. And I think making sure that your investors are kind of on board with that mission at that early funding stage is really important, because things go wrong. Like a pandemic happens. Like, you know, there's that screws up supply chains. There's, you know, unexpected cultural things that happen and really can delay things in ways you just didn't expect.
Yeah, definitely. And what is next for you?
Oh gosh. So I'm kind of in this very active thinking stage, which has been very fun. So as Nao mentioned, I'm attending graduate school at McGill University in their International Health Leadership program. to finally say I have a master's and quell all the questions around why don't I have a graduate degree, which is apparently needed in healthcare. But it's also been a lovely program, and I work with a lot of international physicians in that program as well. And as well as that, I'm talking to a couple different startups about kind of being a more permanent, like, global health advisor, who've taken some interesting takes on working and a specific clinical need that their product addresses in East Africa as well as in the US, which is always interesting to find, as well, and some other kind of cancer initiatives that are interesting, and pharmacy as well.
Wow.
So it's kind of an interesting path. I don't like thinking about one product anymore for any specific period of time. And then I'm also investigating and talking to a couple different groups about starting some more global health innovation focused programming, potentially within an academia program that would be much more business school focused, as well as public health, not just sort of, sorry for the Hopkins students who just graduated, but not just focused on pure engineering and pure public health rationale, often guided by like that project thinking, not that organizational thinking. So I think those are kind of where I'm trying to work on pushing towards next.
Wonderful, exciting. So I have my last question. I'll open it up for Q&A from everyone. So what are 3 concrete things that early stage entrepreneurs can do right now to prepare for launching a product abroad?
Oh man, so abroad, I can't talk to Europe. I don't know enough about Europe, frankly, but for some of like the LMICs and even looking at, you know, just low resource areas in the US even, because I think of those as very different markets. And I mentioned this once already, but I really think the first thing is when you're looking at capital, look for patient capital.
Yeah.
And I think it's changed a lot since we were first looking at capital. But sometimes the social enterprise funds are not always your best friend, because they can give very bad terms and then ask for additional work, like health metrics and all these things, and give you a lot of extra work. But also finding that partner that just understands that, you know, you're figuring things out, and you're, you know, figuring out, you know, what are those appropriate pivots that you need to make in entering these markets. The second thing is really getting your publications in order. And this is something that I wish we did sooner at Sisu. We had some initial sort of abstracts out there and things, but we weren't able to get a fully peer-reviewed publication out in a timely manner. We did end up doing it, but it would have helped a lot for marketing later on and showing this is proven, especially if you can get it proven somehow in the US, even if it's bench testing, and be able to prove that and then use that for marketing later. It's really beneficial. And then the third piece, which I've been starting to investigate with some US startups actually, and just having conversations about, especially in fertility health and doula and midwifery in the US, and so care management around birth, is engaging with policy. So that could be a lot of different things. So, you know, in the US right now, there's a lot of policy that's being sort of looked at for encouraging more maternal health initiatives and maternity leave. Like, being a part of those conversations, I think is really important, because it kind of, maybe it's more of where the world's changed, and showing that you're a part of a certain stance is really important. But for example, a really great company called Femly, who's Baltimore based, and they create these wonderful feminine hygiene products that are organic. And the founder, Ariane Long, has this amazing story about how she actually, I think it was cancer, had a nearly fatal incident with cancer related to bleaches and things that were in feminine care products. And she created this amazing, just like a dispenser, basically, where it was a lot easier to get feminine products in bathrooms. And almost, I think within like a month or so of her like kind of sending this out into social media and saying like, this is an idea that I'm gonna send out as a pre-launch, there was, I think in New York and California, both mandated that schools had to have these products for free.
Mhm.
So because of her like ingenuity, she's brilliant, being able to understand that that was some sort of policy change. Now her product is going crazy and she didn't have to do a ton of marketing because there was such policy pieces in place.
Yeah.
Another brief example, and then I want to hear everyone's questions, is in Kenya, we were engaging with the blood transfusion and donor groups. So think of it kind of like their Red Cross, but
Mhm.
more like their governing body. They had 2 lines in their book around auto transfusion guidance. And so one of the efforts that we tried to do, I don't know if it ended up changing, but I think it informally changed, was adding what is auto transfusion? What are those guidelines for hospitals in Kenya to adopt auto transfusion versus donor blood, because donor
Mhm.
blood is so scarce.
Yeah.
So policy, I think at an early stage and having at least an understanding of where that's
Mhm.
going to go in whatever market you're looking at can be really informative to help
Yeah.
your marketing later.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. So now I want to open up to Q&A from everyone. Yes, Wayne.
Thanks, Katie. Very interesting. One of the, I'm going to oversimplify. A lot of what I took away from your conversation was focused on NGOs and nonprofits, and you did have some comments on the for-profit / commercial sector. One of the things that our organization is very bent on is what's referred to as venture philanthropy, if you're familiar with that.
I think
Any comments on that?
Well, can you define it? Because I think that's something that we were dealing with like 5 years ago when we were looking at it. But are you looking at like donor fund, like donor advised funds? Is that the sort of piece?
Well, the idea behind venture philanthropy is that you don't have venture capital and you're not a public company, but you're focused on innovation and you're willing to take a risk. You still have you're still high on accountability and deliverables, which is the venture part, but you're more focused on the product and the cause and the innovations associated with it, which is the nonprofit organization part.
So I do know what that is. I think it's, the name just keeps evolving, and it's that space has changed just a lot since I was helping fundraise at Sisu, and it's grown a lot, which I think is fantastic. I think it's great. I mean, I think for a lot of wealthy people, and especially younger wealthy people who want to like invest in things that they feel are worthwhile, that's a trend that you see happening. That's a great way for them to like feel like they're investing in something, and just making sure that they have this expectation, going back to this idea around patient capital, that they might get their exact return back in 5 years. And that's okay, because you have to think about with any venture funding, they want to see that you're at least competing with inflation at 7%. So if you can at least, even a venture philanthropy, I think is trying to do that, at least to say, look, we're only going to get a 1x or a 2x back from this at most, versus some of the VC funding we ended up getting, the expectation is more like 7x. And that's a scary thing when you have to deal with a lot of these like issues. The other pieces is I see a lot of like the nonprofit and for-profit models being blurred, the lines being blurred significantly around. We've always traditionally thought nonprofits were always mission driven, and always thought for-profits were always bottom line driven. And I think that's becoming very blurred, and that it's more a tax classification than anything now.
Okay, very good. The follow-on to that is, how does that play in when you're dealing with non-first world countries?
So We definitely got some, I would say, I mean, you could even classify some angel investments as venture philanthropy. We definitely had like a horde of people and a lot of angel investment who just were very supportive of our mission and who we were as entrepreneurs who invested in us. So, I mean, for example, UNICEF is supposedly opening a fund that they're going to do VC investment. I have no idea how they're going to do that because it's totally contrary to like how UNICEF operates. But they claim they're going to have a venture capital fund in one of the offices of innovation, and I'm really curious what that's going to look like. And it's a completely different office than where I work. But I don't know yet what are the expectations for that fund. And there's a lot more. So, for example, the head of my center comes from a VC background in Denmark. So there's a lot more of this kind of crossover happening, especially in this like global health space. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Alex?
Yeah, great listening to you, Katie. I kind of relate a lot to trying to make a mission-based thing that, especially for these African countries. During my PhD, I was lucky enough to go to Uganda and bring our box over there, and we were developing this rapid PCR test, and I really want that to be a part of what we're trying to make now. But now going through, all the business planning, everyone says, there's a market in the US, make it in the US, and then go back. So I guess my first question would be, are there good examples of companies that are making stuff in the US and then still maintain values that can translate to these countries? And then the other part of my question is, with global health, it seems like you said, it's so important to have these relationships on the ground. And I was wondering how you went about making those and who were the most important people that you talked to.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, Sisu Global Health is the company that's doing that, and they're still operating and selling in multiple countries, and we can offload that. Sorry, shameless plug. But there's actually, it's been interesting because, I didn't expect to try and consult in this sort of space because I really didn't see a lot of companies that could afford consultants who would be interested in this space. But there's actually a company based in Baltimore that is doing PCR work for esophageal cancer, called Capsulomics, and they're a Hopkins spin out. And it's been really interesting talking to him as a founder because he has no experience in East Africa, but he is really interested in the fact that there's a very clear clinical impact for both East Africa and for the US. And so it's been interesting to see the interest grow and just understanding that, at the end of the day, we have to diagnose people for cancer, and that cancer is not a thing that is exclusive to the US. So how do we make sure that is something that fits for a lot of the other markets? The other piece that I will add to is my colleague at UNICEF works on a partnership with developing an oxygen concentrator that is more fitting. So oxygen concentrators are typically used in the US for home care. And so what happened during COVID is a lot of those were just delivered straight out, the same ones you would use in your grandma's house to deal with her COPD. And they just don't work anymore, but they were helpful in a pinch during COVID. So he's doing a huge partnership with several manufacturers in the US to develop called a TPP. And I forget what that acronym means. There's too many acronyms at UNICEF, but a product specification list. He's a biomedical engineer to develop that with a Philips or with these other groups. So there is interest, and there are these big medical device companies that exist in each of those countries as well. I forgot your second question. Sorry, I went on a tangent.
No, that's great. How did you make those initial connections with the people on the ground, and who were the most important connections that you made?
So the longest connections happened because we co-developed the product Hemafuse with Komfonoche Teaching Hospital in Kumasi, Ghana. And that started from a University of Michigan program of actually going to hospital, doing user experience interviews and observational pieces, and really co-developing it with them. And it's been really cool to go back to them and be like, this is a product you co-developed, and here now, it's at your hospital. It took, 7 years of saying, it'll come, but it happened. And so they have been, several of the clinicians there have been big advocates for us. One of them ended up giving us a recommendation that got us our first big USAID grant. And so initially, a lot of the grant funding we got was kind of that sort of global health funding, grant funding. And then from then on, it's just being present. I mean, a lot of these countries and a lot of these clinicians have seen so much turnover as far as NGOs and, just being a white person who goes to Africa occasionally. But the fact that I would show up every 6 weeks and try to develop these things, I still have great relationships with people in these different places. And it's a lot of work, but it's also changed over COVID too. And I've seen a lot more kind of like those digital sort of networks happen again that have been really valuable too. So.
Gil?
Thanks, Katie. So one of the ways that we've been getting a lot of good ideas lately on things to build is talking with particularly military trauma surgeons. So they were in Afghanistan, this worked, they didn't have any communications bandwidth, et cetera, et cetera. So they're very good at identifying problems that are suitable locally. And while you were talking, I was thinking about Doctors Without Borders. They fly into these horrible situations. Did you ever work with them? Did you ever ask them, is there any gizmo you'd really like to have, or something along those, any process, procedure, that sort of thing?
So yeah, we had several conversations with Doctors Without Borders, and they're kind of the rebels of the NGO world, for lack of a better insight. They're actually doing autotransfusion, but with not savory methods. And so in a way that would be very easily replaceable with our device. And I think there's always this sort of weird tension between NGOs and private industry that is just, frankly, it gets very obnoxious, and that we're saying the same things until a certain point where, something bad happens, or there's not an appreciation that when you're developing a product, sometimes like it doesn't go according to plan. There's this expectation that a product appears and it's done and it's ready and it's always going to do the same thing. So they had a very bad experience in Finland at some hospital. And so we were interviewing with them, and they just didn't like that we had only had approval in Kenya and Ghana, and that we didn't have US FDA approval, even though they were fine continuing to use syringes in the same way, totally unvalidated, probably causing more harm than good, not sterilizing, like all these sort of things, because Doctors Without Borders, their goal is to get into some of the worst situations that you mentioned with whatever they can bring in. And so even though our product was an amazing fit, this is where NGOs just get a little bit weird, for lack of a better term, around some of the politics. Because the other thing is there's a lot of tension in fundraising for these groups that isn't evident when you're initially talking to them. But I can tell you, kind of looking in the back end of UNICEF, there's so much duplication of effort, because it's like the idea of, I want to be labeled to this so I can get this grant funding from these few sources. And so I think that, combined with this, just like, there's some sort of like collaboration piece that often is just very difficult to get over for groups that are driven to do emergency response, because they're always jumping on the next emergency. And so trying to implement something new, you have to catch them at exactly the right time.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. Maybe we can follow up at another time.
Sure.
Thanks.
Any other questions? We've got a few more minutes. All right. Well, thank you so much. Oh, Alex, did you have a question?
Because I was curious about the local regulatory hurdles for these countries and how they compare to FDA and CE mark.
So they're lower in theory. It's often very much based on relationships. There are a lot of developments recently for like an Africa consortium of regulatory, because each regulatory ends up being very different. And so in some ways it can be a lot lower and say, you know, you did clinical studies with one of the main clinicians in the country and then they recommend their product. It can be that simple, or it can be a lot more onerous and, you know, attempts to try and basically delicately say this, get more money than was required to actually run programs and testing that was totally out of their depth to do.
Great, thanks. Good. I'd love to follow up more later
Sure.
whenever you're available.
Yeah, happy to. I'm a little bit crazy right now, but I'll post I have a scheduler, so I'm happy to talk with anyone on this call or afterwards about where they're at and where they're trying to go. It's always fun to talk to different startups and see where they're at in their life cycle.
Awesome. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Katie. That was very informative and very interesting.
Thanks. I'm happy to have it. So fun. And happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone.
Yes, happy St. Patrick's Day. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.